What do you do when the sky itself lies to you? When every rule, every pattern, every certainty you trust in warfare is shattered by a single dot on a radar screen that should not exist? That was the question French controllers faced on a cold morning over the Western Front, when a lone aircraft appeared drifting across the perimeter slow, off course, harmless. Or so they thought. It was the kind of contact pilots joked about: a lost trainee, a malfunctioning compass, maybe even a damaged engine forcing an emergency glide. Something routine, forgettable. But nothing about this pilot would be routine, and nothing about what happened next would ever be forgotten. The first reports sounded almost comedic. A single fighter flying the wrong direction, like he had missed his airfield by half a continent. One controller scribbled possible navigation error. Another wrote low threat. Not a single officer suspected they were looking at the beginning of the most disruptive air threat France would face in years. That lone aircraft, quiet, unassuming, was already drifting into restricted space with a confidence that didn't match the sloppy flight path. And buried beneath that odd behavior was the real hook. He wasn't broadcasting identification codes. No transponder. No radio contact. Not even the faint emergency signal a damaged aircraft would send. Silence. Total, deliberate silence. That silence is what made a few analysts uneasy. Lost pilots panic on the radio. Wounded aircraft scream for assistance. But this one, he was calm, calculated. He didn't need help. He needed time. And as the dot glided deeper into French airspace, something else unfolded, something the men in the control room would not understand until it was far too late. The pilot wasn't lost. He was measuring, testing, feeling the rhythm of the French response as if he were plucking strings on an instrument only he knew how to play. Every drift, every altitude change, every subtle deviation seemed accidental, yet each one triggered small ripples in the defensive network, the kind of ripples only a seasoned tactician would look for. By the time scramble orders were prepared, the first real shock hit. The aircraft accelerated clean, sharp, intentional. Its engines roared as if waking from hibernation. Controllers froze. Lost pilots don't suddenly fly with precision. Lost pilots don't make perfect climbing turns. Lost pilots don't sprint straight toward the one region France guarded most fiercely. And just like that, a harmless blip transformed into a needle of tension stabbing through every layer of command. Something was coming, something far worse than an error in navigation, something that would push the French Air Force into a crisis it had never anticipated, because they weren't dealing with a mistake, they were dealing with mastery. And while officers tried to react, while protocols struggled to catch up, the mysterious pilot kept climbing, kept closing distance, kept rewriting the script of what an enemy aircraft was supposed to do. His intentions remained hidden, but his message was clear long before the first interception order was spoken. He had come prepared, and he had come alone for a reason. They thought they were tracking a stray, a wanderer, a negligible anomaly. Instead, they were watching the rise of the greatest airborne threat to ever slip past their guard, a ghost in the morning sky, about to reveal just how catastrophic one man could be. If you've made it this far, you already understand the stakes, the tension, and the incredible precision of the pilot who shouldn't have been there. But stories like this only matter if they're remembered, discussed, and shared. Take a moment right now to hit that like button. It helps keep these forgotten moments alive and ensures others can witness the sheer audacity and brilliance of this extraordinary aviator. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Each subscription strengthens our community of history enthusiasts who refuse to let these incredible feats vanish into obscurity. And please, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, or share your thoughts on what it must have felt like to be in the French skies the day a single pilot transformed the battlefield. Your engagement isn't just support. It's a tribute to the pilots, mechanics, and crews who shaped history in ways that textbooks barely touch. The sun had barely climbed over the horizon when the French squadrons began to scramble. Jets of adrenaline cut through the air as pilots rushed to their aircraft, helmets laced tight, goggles reflecting the morning light. Every pre-flight check, every hurried engine test was performed under a singular, unspoken fear that the lost pilot might not be lost at all. And then, just as the last squadron was forming up, the impossible happened. The lone aircraft, previously drifting like a forgotten shadow, surged forward with unanticipated precision. Its trajectory defied the patterns that even the most seasoned French pilots had memorized, curves that should have been impossible, acceleration that should have been dangerous for any average flyer, and a poise in the air that screamed of experience, calculation, and ruthlessness. Witnesses would later describe it as if the aircraft were alive, almost sentient, moving with an elegance that made maneuvering jets appear clumsy by comparison. Within seconds, it had identified weak points in the defensive formation, exploited gaps that no human operator should have noticed, and initiated the first strike. The French pilots, trained to react, found themselves constantly a step behind, chasing shadows that didn't exist. The lone intruder became a phantom menace, striking without warning, disappearing just as swiftly, and leaving confusion in his wake. What made this attack truly impossible wasn't just the speed or act the pilot anticipated. Counter moves, read the opponent's reactions, and adapted instantly, executing tactical decisions that would normally require multiple squadron leaders to coordinate. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, reports trickled in. A fighter here, a damaged aircraft there, all within zones thought secure. The French air defense network struggled to make sense of the audacity unfolding above. Each strike seemed random, yet each was meticulously calculated, targeting vulnerabilities that only someone intimately familiar with aerial combat doctrine could exploit. The pilots on the ground felt the tremors of a genius, a tuerta, eerie combination of recklessness and mastery that left no room for error. Every failed interception was another testament to the growing threat, a single mind bending the rules of engagement into a personal war of inevitability, and just when it seemed the chaos had reached its peak. Another twist. The aircraft didn't retreat after its first strike. It hovered in a pattern that defied conventional tactics, daring the French forces to react, daring them to expose themselves further. This audacity was more than bravado, it was strategy. By maintaining proximity to the targeted squadrons, the pilot forced a chain reaction of mistakes, miscalculations, and overextensions, exploiting human limitations at every turn. The French pilots were no longer defenders. They were participants in a deadly game where every move had been anticipated, every error exploited, and every action meticulously countered. The French command realized, almost too late, that the anomaly in the sky wasn't a fluke, a miscalculation, or a minor threat. It was a masterclass in offensive air tactics, executed by a single, extraordinary pilot. The impossible attack wasn't just a momentary victory. It was a declaration, a signal that the rules had changed and that the skies over France would never feel the same. The chaos it sowed would reverberate for days, shaking confidence, altering strategies, and forcing an entire air force to question the assumptions they had relied on for decades. Nobody understood how he vanished. One moment he was carving through the French formation with predatory confidence. The next, he was gone ready to return. No visual confirmation, no engine trace. A sky once crowded with scrambling fighters suddenly felt cavernous and empty, as if the intruder had dissolved into the morning air. Pilots circled in confusion, analysts pored over flickering screens, and commanders barked orders that no longer matched the reality unfolding above them. This was the moment France realized the pilot wasn't merely skilled, he was an invisible hunter, able to manipulate fear as effectively as aerodynamics. His disappearance wasn't a retreat, it was a tactic. While French fighters spread out to relocate him, they unknowingly created the perfect web of blind spots openings he exploited with surgical precision. Without warning, explosions echoed across the horizon. A fighter spiraled down in flames. Another limped back toward base, with smoke pouring from its fuselage. And just as the French pilots prepared to counterattack, the Phantom vanished again. This pattern repeated like a cruel rhythm. Strike, mislead, disappear, strike again. No one could predict where he would reappear. No one could decipher the logic behind his movements. The sky became a battlefield painted by randomness yet guided by mastery. What made him terrifying wasn't just his ability to exploit radar weakness, it was the psychological collapse he engineered. French pilots began reporting visual illusions, reflections that looked like aircraft, shadows that moved like thoughts. Their senses were overloading, their instincts betraying them. They weren't fighting a human opponent anymore. They were fighting their own fear, crafted expertly by a pilot who understood that invisibility is the deadliest weapon in aerial combat. Every second he remained unseen amplified the dread, stretching nerves to their breaking point. Inside command, the tension became suffocating. Officers demanded explanations. Radar crews recalibrated systems repeatedly. Strategists combed through historical logs for patterns, comparing the intruder's behavior to known doctrines, but nothing matched. His tactics resembled ghost stories told among elite fighter squadrons. Sudden strikes from impossible angles, mid-air vanishing acts, flawless reversals. He wasn't flying like an enemy. They flew like multiple enemies operating through a single machine. And with each successful ambush, the legend grew. Then came the turning point, as a French squadron regrouped near the coast, believing they had finally created a defensive wedge too tight to exploit. The hunter struck again, this time from above, diving at a velocity so extreme the French radars barely registered it before impact. The squadron scattered in panic. The sky fractured into desperate maneuvers, distorted formations, and frantic radio calls. He had reappeared exactly where no one thought a human pilot could sustain control, threading through high-altitude turbulence with predatory grace, using the very instability of the upper atmosphere as camouflage. France finally understood the truth. They were up against a pilot who didn't simply break rules, he rewrote them. His mastery of altitude, manipulation, radar evasion, and psychological warfare transformed familiar skies into a labyrinth of terror. Every jet scrambled against him became another potential victim of misdirection, ambush, or fear. By the time the intruder's third ambush shattered yet another formation, France could no longer pretend this was a contained incident. The scale, the precision, the psychological rupture, everything pointed to a threat unlike anything their air command had trained for. What began as a minor anomaly had spiraled into a crisis severe enough to trigger protocols reserved for full-scale invasions. For the first time that morning, the word catastrophic appeared in official reports. France wasn't dealing with infiltration. They were dealing with domination. Commanders ordered a desperate counteroffensive and unprecedented mobilization of fighters, reconnaissance aircraft, and ground-based tracking systems. Every available asset surged into the sky. Pilots were briefed in frantic, clipped phrases, their mission no longer to intercept, but to contain. It was a subtle shift in language, but one that revealed the fear creeping through even the highest ranks. They weren't trying to win the engagement. They were trying to stop the bleeding before their airspace collapsed entirely. Yet even with France's full force mobilized, the intruder remained infuriatingly unpredictable. He exploited the very nature of coordinated response. The time it took to issue orders, the small delays between radar confirmation and pilot action, the rigid structure of defensive grids, where France responded like a machine-precise, procedural, methodical, the intruder moved like instinct incarnate. He slipped through the seams, attacked from impossible vectors, and most disturbingly seemed to anticipate every French maneuver seconds before it occurred. It wasn't luck, it was insight earned from a lifetime inside the cockpit. The counteroffensive's first major push came over the central defense corridor, where a dozen French fighters formed an impenetrable crescent designed to funnel the intruder toward a kill box. On paper, it was flawless. In practice, it became a lesson in how deeply outmatched they were. Before the formation could lock on, the intruder burst upward in a vertical climb so aggressive it momentarily blinded the jet's sensors. By the time they recalibrated, he had already flipped into a downward assault, slicing through the formation's highest point and forcing every pilot to break position. What was meant to be a trap became a massacre of coordination itself. No enemies shot down, no advantage gained, only disarray and humiliation. In the command room, silence replaced shouting. Analysts realized the intruder wasn't simply reacting faster. He was creating chain reactions. His movements lured French pilots into predictable patterns, making them easy to manipulate. Each counteroffensive attempt gave him new data timing intervals, reaction speeds, positional tendencies. He was studying them with terrifying clarity, carving his understanding of the French Air Force in real time, using their own structure against them like a mirror turned into a weapon. The most devastating moment came when France deployed its elite interception wing, the squadron reserved for the nation's highest priority threats. These pilots were Legends Ace fighters, combat veterans, tacticians who could reshape battles with a single maneuver. And yet, their debut in the sky that morning was met with chilling indifference. The intruder didn't flee. He didn't hide. He invited them. His aircraft hovered at the edge of their radar range like a challenge, taunting the very best France had to offer. The encounter that followed wasn't a battle. It was a revelation. The elite wing, once feared across continents, found themselves cornered, outpaced, and forced into defensive spirals they hadn't practiced since their earliest training days. The intruder controlled the rhythm of engagement: fast, slow, vanish, strike, vanish again. By the squadron regrouped. They had lost more in reputation than in machinery. The French sky, once a symbol of national strength, now felt like an arena built for a single master. And in that moment, France finally accepted the truth. This wasn't a rogue pilot. This wasn't an accident. This was a calculated demonstration of superiority, one that demanded answers, demanded retaliation, and demanded a new understanding of warfare itself. What happened next would later be studied in military as a cautionary tale, but as a masterstroke of aerial warfare. With France's counteroffensive unraveling, the intruder unveiled a tactic so unorthodox, so precise, that it rewrote the logic of the battlefield in a single, fluid maneuver. It started with a sudden dive, steep, reckless, seemingly suicidal. French pilots watching from above believed for a brief moment that the mysterious aviator had finally miscalculated. But this was no mistake. It was bait, a deliberate plunge into what appeared to be a vulnerable position, designed to trigger the French instinct to pursue. And they did. Every fighter within range pivoted, engines roaring as they dove after him. This is where the brilliance emerged. Halfway through the descent, the intruder executed a maneuver no one expected. He reversed momentum with a violent torque roll, flipping the aircraft upward into a vertical climb. Gravity should have punished him. His wings should have stalled. Yet the aircraft responded like an extension of his own muscles, stabilizing in an instant. Meanwhile, the French fighters, committed to their downward momentum, overshot the point of interception completely, scattering into chaotic trajectories that shattered their formation. In a matter of seconds, the hunter had transformed an entire squadron into exposed targets, each one desperately trying to correct altitude and recover control. The tactic stunned observers. It violated every predictable pattern of aerial engagement. Pilots were trained to maintain energy advantage, to avoid reckless dives, to respect the limits of their machines. But the intruder rejected those principles entirely. He used the French reliance on structured doctrine against them, manipulating their expectations like chess pieces on a tilted board. And once he forced them into disarray, he struck with chilling precision, targeting only the aircraft that posed strategic danger, leaving others untouched, as if he were pruning threats rather than fighting enemies. Inside the French command center, panic shifted into disbelief. Analysts replayed radar logs, trying to understand how a maneuver so abrupt, so physically demanding, had been executed without catastrophic consequences. Engineers debated structural stress. Tacticians debated timing. Veterans debated whether such mastery was even humanly possible. But no one could deny the results. The French defensive grid had collapsed again, not because of superior numbers or superior technology, but because of a single tactical innovation wielded with supernatural finesse. And the tactic didn't end there. Once he gained altitude, the intruder used the momentary confusion to disappear into a thermal pocket riding, a column of rising air that masked his signature from radar sweeps. To the French, he had simply vanished. 1 second they were tracking him. The next, their screens were empty. The sky turned quiet. Too quiet. That eerie silence, same strategic silence, wielded Elia descended once more, gripping every pilot with the fear of where he might strike next. French leadership knew at last what they were dealing with. Not just an enemy pilot, but a tactician capable of bending aerial physics into psychological warfare. His tactic was more than a maneuver. It was a message. He was telling them that no formation was safe, no altitude secure, no doctrine reliable. He had rewritten the sky's hierarchy and placed himself at the top. There are days in military history that carve themselves into the collective memory of a nation, days when strategies collapse, when expectations shatter, when a single moment forces an entire armed force to question everything it thought it knew. For France, that day arrived when the intruder turned his focus toward an entire squadron, one of the most respected and battle-hardened units in the French Air Force. These were not rookies. These were veterans, pilots whose names carried weight in every briefing room, aviators who had survived wars, crises, and encounters that should have broken lesser men. But none of them were prepared for what one lone pilot was about to unleash upon them. It began with a silence that felt engineered. The squadron patrolled in tight formation, scanning the empty sky, each pilot knowing that the intruder could be anywhere and yet detecting nothing. The radar screens showed a clear expanse. The thermal scans were empty. Even ground observers reported no visual traces. It felt for a fleeting moment like the threat had passed. But experienced pilots know that when the sky feels too calm, something is wrong. And they were right. The attack came from an angle so unconventional that even the most aggressive combat simulations had never accounted for it. The intruder descended from the upper atmosphere in a near-vertical dive, using the sun itself as camouflage. The squadron didn't see an aircraft. They saw a glare, a blinding sheet of light. And by the time the silhouette broke through that brilliance, the intruder was already upon them. His first strike severed the formation instantly, splitting the squadron into two halves that struggled to maintain cohesion. Panic rippled through the pilots as they tried to reorient, but the intruder was already accelerating into his next maneuver. He wove through their ranks with a speed that seemed impossible, cutting across air currents and exploiting microbursts that only the most instinctive aviators could ride without losing control. Each pass he made wasn't random. It was calculated to dismantle their communication, disrupt their visual tracking, and force them into defensive spirals. Veterans who had survived years of combat now felt the same disorientation as new trainees encountering their first dogfight. It wasn't that they lacked skill. It was that the intruder fought on a level they had never even imagined. In less than 3 minutes, the sky transformed into a mosaic of smoke trails and shattered formations. Radios crackled with frantic calls. He's behind us, no. Above break, now regroup, watch. You're 6. He's gone. Every command contradicted the last. Every attempt at coordination collapsed under the weight of confusion. The squadron had become a labyrinth of blind spots, and the intruder navigated it with predatory ease. What made the event legendary was not the destruction itself, but the restraint. The intruder didn't eliminate every pilot. He didn't seek total annihilation. Instead, he targeted key aircraft, the leader, the secondary pivot, the communication relay. Removed those 3, and the entire squadron collapsed under its own structure. That was the true brilliance of his strategy. He wasn't fighting 12 pilots. He was fighting the idea of a squadron, the architecture that held them together. And he dismantled it piece by piece. As the remaining aircraft limped away, dazed and humiliated, one truth settled over the French command like a suffocating fog. This lone pilot wasn't just outperforming their best, he was outthinking their entire system. That day, France lost not just machinery, not just formation integrity, but confidential resource far more valuable and far harder to rebuild. By the time the French skies were reduced to a landscape of uncertainty, one question echoed through every command room, every cockpit, every trembling debriefing. Who is he? No tactical manuals could explain his maneuvers. No intelligence reports matched his methods. No known airspace or present possessed a signature resembling the ghost who now haunted their radar screens. The intruder's identity had become a myth whispered in fear, a shadow stretching across every strategic discussion. And yet, in the absence of truth, a lie took root, a lie so powerful it fueled panic more effectively than any confirmed fact ever could. The first rumor emerged from a fractured squadron, its pilots shaken and desperate to rationalize their defeat. Someone claimed the intruder must have been flying a prototype aircraft, something stolen, experimental, beyond anything the French arsenal could match. Engineers dismissed the theory, but the seed had been planted. Minutes later, another rumor surfaced. The pilot wasn't human at all, but an automated combat system, a machine built to outperform human limitations. Analysts laughed at the idea, yet the thought lingered in the minds of exhausted officers whose screens had shown an opponent with inhuman reflexes. But the lie that truly ignited panic came from a far more authoritative source, a misinterpreted intelligence note that circulated through the upper ranks. The message referenced a defector, a pilot from a foreign unit known for extreme tactics, someone believed to have disappeared years prior under suspicious circumstances. The note never identified him by name. It never confirmed he was alive, but that didn't matter. The possibility alone spread like fire. Within hours, the French Air Force convinced itself that the intruder was not just a rogue pilot, but a legendary aviator once rumored to have mastered impossible aerial techniques, a man whose reputation had already drifted into the realm of ghost stories. This false identity reshaped everything. Pilots who once flew confidently now entered the sky, imagining they were facing a phantom trained beyond human limits. Officers strategized not against a tangible threat, but against a mythical enemy inflated by fear, speculation, and the psychological collapse unfolding across their ranks. Each time the intruder vanished, the myth grew stronger. Each time he reappeared, striking with surgical precision, the legend twisted deeper into the minds of those who tried to stop him and the intruder. He used this lie as fuel. He maneuvered in ways that encouraged the myth, striking with irregular timing, exploiting weather patterns to enhance the illusion of supernatural awareness, deliberately leaving gaps that intelligence officers would attempt to fill with their own terrified assumptions. He didn't just dominate the battlefield, he dominated the narrative. The French weren't fighting a man anymore. They were fighting an idea, an apparition crafted from equal parts skill and psychological warfare. The truth, when it finally emerged, would shake France even more than the myth. For the pilot's identity was far from legendary. It wasn't heroic or mythical or tied to a defector with impossible training. It was something far more unsettling because it proved that anyone with the right preparation, the right mindset, and the right determination could bring a nation to its knees. By now, the French Air Force had endured physical losses, structural collapse, and tactical humiliation, but none of it compared to the invisible assault unfolding inside the minds of their pilots. The intruder had mastered something far more devastating than aerial maneuvers or technological superiority. He had weaponized fear. Every appearance, every disappearance, every impossible strike was orchestrated not to destroy machinery, but to dismantle confidence itself. And for a fighter pilot, confidence is oxygen. Once it fails, everything else follows. It began subtly. Pilots reported hesitation during engagements, microseconds of doubt that in aerial combat might as well be a lifetime. Eyes darted to mirrors more often. Voices cracked on the radio. Posture stiffened. Every aircraft shadow looked suspicious. Every glint of sunlight hinted at danger. Veterans who once flew with icy calm now felt the tremor of uncertainty in their hands. The intruder had infected them with anticipation, the expectation of attack even when he wasn't present. He didn't need to fire a shot to damage a squadron. He needed only to exist somewhere in the sky. This psychological erosion intensified with each encounter. When pilots failed to locate him on radar, their imaginations filled the void. When they found no consistent pattern to his attacks, their instincts collapsed. When he vanished for extended periods, the silence itself became a threat. The French weren't simply fighting a pilot, they were fighting the dread of not knowing. And dread, as military history proves, is one of the most paralyzing forces on any battlefield. At command headquarters, strategists attempted to reframe the narrative, urging pilots to remain rational, disciplined, grounded in protocol. But the intruder anticipated that too. He had manipulated timing to strike precisely when morale seemed to steady, interrupting briefings with sudden radar anomalies. Attacking a patrol seconds after reassurance messages, reappearing in regions thought completely secure, he understood the rhythm of hope and crushed it strategically, reducing every moment of optimism into another point of failure. What made his psychological warfare unprecedented was the level of intimacy he seemed to have with his opponent's minds. He exploited human behavior as effectively as terrain or fuel capacity. He waited for pilots to exhale before diving. He struck when formations tightened, knowing structure gave pilots comfort. And he disappeared when the French finally summoned the courage to pursue. Each action rewired their expectations, conditioning them to mistrust their training, their equipment, even themselves. Soon, fatigue became universal. Pilots flew with shaking legs, crews slept on base floors. Commanders engaged in arguments over interpretations of radar signatures, unable to trust their own reasoning. Maps were redrawn multiple times an hour. Doctrines rewritten before they were tested. The French Air Force, one of the most respected in Europe, had become a bundle of underreacting, reacting to ghosts the intruder crafted with precision. And yet, through all this destruction, he maintained an eerie restraint. He avoided eliminating pilots unless necessary, allowing word of his maneuvers to spread. He targeted communication lines over fuel tanks, instruments over pilots, structured over... He knew that living witnesses were more valuable than casualties because witnesses talk. Witnesses amplify. Witnesses carry fear further than any missile could. His brilliance lay in a simple, chilling truth. He didn't need to defeat France in the sky. He only needed to make them believe they were already defeated. By the time the final confrontation approached, France was no longer fighting for dominance of its own airspace, it was fighting for psychological survival. The intruder had reduced entire squadrons to scattered remnants. He had severed communication lines, dismantled formations, and burrowed so deeply into French military doctrine that commanders questioned whether traditional tactics had any value left at all. But every saga, no matter how overwhelming, reaches a point where retreat is no longer possible. France needed a victory ni victory to stop the erosion of morale. And so, they assembled a final response. A hand-picked unit of elite pilots trained in advanced aerial combat, conditioned to resist psychological breakdown, and briefed in absolute secrecy. Their mission was simple: force the intruder into a decisive duel. The plan took shape in the dusk, when the fading light painted the sky in shades that made detection difficult. French analysts believed the intruder relied heavily on the interplay of sunlight, atmospheric distortion, and radar seams. Twilight, they reasoned, would dull his advantages. And, for a brief moment, that theory held. As the elite unit took flight, sensors detected a faint anomaly, a movement too precise to be accidental. The intruder was near. But unlike every previous encounter, he didn't strike. He hovered, observing, waiting. He had understood the challenge, and he accepted it. The duel began with a slow, almost ceremonial dance. Both sides circled through layers of atmosphere, feeling out the other's rhythm. The French pilots expected aggression. Instead, they found calculation. The intruder did not rush his attacks. He forced the engagement into a psychological stalemate, drawing the elites deeper into his pace, teaching them, in real time, the rules of a battle fought on his terms. Then, without warning, he broke formation with a maneuver so abrupt it seemed as if the air itself shattered. The sky erupted into motion. What followed was chaos wrapped in brilliance. The intruder dove between two elite fighters, threading a gap barely larger than his wingspan. He executed a horizontal snap roll to evade incoming Lacans, then flipped into a climb so sharp the French radars briefly lost his signature. The elite unit responded with practiced coordination, splitting into 3 groups to cut off escape vectors. But the intruder anticipated each division perfectly. He turned their geometry against them, redirecting their pursuit angles and forcing collisions of strategy rather than aircraft. Every time they closed the distance, he slipped through a blind spot he created milliseconds earlier, as though he were reading lines from a script the French couldn't see. Then came the moment that would define the duel. The intruder rose into the upper atmosphere, a region where oxygen thins and engines strain. No pilot willingly fights there. It's a place of limitations, not opportunities. Yet he climbed higher, challenging the elite unit to follow, and follow they did. At that altitude, machinery falters and instincts sharpen. The French pilots fought with every ounce of training, every fragment of discipline they had honed over years. For the first time, the intruder faced opponents who refused to break. He retaliated with a maneuver so violent it defied the limits of physics, a hybrid turn and roll executed at near stall speed, using atmospheric drag to pivot his aircraft like a blade. The elites were forced apart. One pilot lost control momentarily. Another fell behind. The intruder seized the advantage, diving through the formation with predatory precision. But then, something unexpected happened. The French pilots adapted. They mirrored his timing. They learned from his rhythm. They countered, not with doctrine, but with instinct, realizing that the only way to defeat someone who broke the rules was to abandon the rules themselves. For the first time all morning, the intruder faltered not out of fear, but out of recognition. He was facing opponents who understood him. The duel shifted. It became not a lecture from a master to students, but a confrontation between equals. The sky trembled with the force of their maneuvers, trails of vapor spiraling like signatures across the fading light. In those moments, the intruder stopped being a ghost. He became human again, brilliant, overwhelming, but mortal. Yet even with this shift, the outcome remained uncertain. The duel ended not in triumph, but in a disappearance. Just when the French pilots believed they had cornered him, the intruder executed one final dive into a thermal corridor so narrow no radar could track it. He vanished beneath the horizon, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the sky itself was exhaling. France didn't win, but for the first time, it didn't lose. And that balance fragile, tense, unfinished route, the French understanding of aerial warfare forever long. After the smoke trails faded and the final reports were filed, France found itself grappling with a truth far more unsettling than the battle itself. The intruder had rewritten the very foundations of their military doctrine. No confirmed footage, no captured aircraft, no identifying documents, only fragments of radar data, pilot testimonies trembling with disbelief, and a trail of tactical failures that pointed to one undeniable conclusion. A single man in a single aircraft had exposed vulnerabilities that nations spent decades pretending didn't exist. And whether they accepted it publicly or buried it beneath classifications, the impact of his actions carved a new era into the history of aerial warfare. The first change came quietly. Analysts began reevaluating long-standing assumptions about air superiority, realizing that strength in numbers meant little against an enemy who understood human psychology more deeply than mechanical specifications. Entire sections of the French manual had to be doctrines that once stood firm were marked with red ink. Pilots were retrained to think asymmetrically, to question patterns, to expect the unexpected. For the first time, unpredictability became a formalized component of national defense strategy. And it wasn't just France. Whispers of the incident leaked, traveling through Allied intelligence circles with the momentum of a growing legend. Other nations began tightening their radar protocols, updating their countermaneuver libraries, and studying thermal anomalies with renewed obsession. Somewhere in war rooms across Europe, commanders debated whether they were prepared to face someone like him or worse, money like him. The fear he created did not remain in French airspace. It seeped outward into the global understanding of aerial combat. Yet the most profound legacy was philosophical. The intruder proved that innovation wasn't solely the domain of technology. It wasn't hidden inside prototypes or classified weaponry. It lived in the mind of the pilot, the instincts he trusted, the rules he dared to break, the psychology he manipulated with surgical precision. He demonstrated that one individual, equipped with unmatched insight and absolute audacity, could challenge an entire military structure. That idea terrified nations, but it also inspired a new generation of aviators. Young pilots began studying the incident like scripture. They watched reconstructed simulations, examined forbidding after-action notes, and practiced maneuvers their instructors once called reckless. They sought to understand not only how he flew, but why. What made him dive into danger when logic demanded retreat? What allowed him to vanish into atmospheric gaps that others overlooked? What mindset turned the sky into a chessboard where he played 12 moves ahead? In quiet halls of aviation academies, instructors whispered a truth they would never write on paper. This ghost changed everything. His legacy endured not because of destruction, but because of revelation. He forced nations to confront their over-reliance on structure. He shattered the illusion that technology alone guaranteed safety. And he reminded the world that in rising life, the most dangerous opponent is the one who understands fear, bends unpredictability, and refuses to follow the script. Even today, pilots still report strange moments in the sky. A radar flicker, a sudden gust that feels intentional, a maneuver seen from afar that reminds them of the legend. They joke about him in mess halls, but the laughter always sounds a little forced, because deep down, every aviator knows what France learned the hard way. One man can redefine the sky, and once that boundary is broken, it is never the same again. If you're still here, it means the story of this mysterious pilot resonated with you as deeply as it has with aviation historians, military analysts, and anyone who understands how a single moment can reshape an entire era. Now, I want to ask you for something simple but incredibly important. If this video opened your eyes to a side of military history that textbooks rarely show, take a second to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription helps us continue uncovering the hidden battles, forgotten legends, and extraordinary individuals who changed the course of warfare. If you watched until the very last moment, let me know by commenting "The Sky Remembers" below. That phrase tells me you stayed with the story, felt the tension, and connected with the legacy of a pilot who defied the impossible. And of course, don't forget to leave a like. It's one click for you. but it makes an enormous difference in helping this content reach others who love this kind of deep, cinematic storytelling. Thank you for watching until the end. Now, if you want to keep exploring the secret chapters of military history, click on the next video that's appearing on your screen. The sky holds many more stories, and some of them are even stranger than this one.